The morning started quiet, the sun spilling soft light through the dusty windows of the little shop. Myra had been up since dawn, arranging fresh bread on the wooden shelves and wiping the counter clean. It was her routine, her small way of keeping the shop ready for the few loyal customers who still came. Outside, the street was calm. Only the sound of distant footsteps and the smell of baked bread drifting into the air. Myra's family had run this shop for years. Even when times were hard, it wasn't big or fancy, but it was hers. She took pride in the neat rows of goods, the polished jars, and the warm smile she gave to anyone who walked in. She didn't have much money, but she had dignity, and to her, that was worth more than gold. The bell over the door rang. She looked up, expecting the usual old lady who came for bread. Instead, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped inside. His shoes were polished so bright they seemed to shine in the morning light. His hair was slicked back. His wrist carried a watch that looked more expensive than her entire shop Mira's. Eyes narrowed slightly. She knew this face, Daniel Voss. Everyone in town knew his name. He was the man who bought buildings just to tear them down, who made deals that ruined small businesses. A billionaire who didn't care who got crushed. As long as he stayed on top, Myra's chest tightened. What was he doing here? Daniel's gaze swept the shop with an expression that made Mira's stomach twist. His eyes lingered on the shelves, as if he was examining something cheap and unworthy. He took slow steps forward, the click of his shoes echoing in the small space. Small place, he said, his voice deep and heavy with arrogance. I didn't think places like this still existed. Mira kept her tone calm. We still have customers who like good service, she replied. Daniel's lips curved into a half smile, the kind that wasn't friendly. He picked up a jar from the shelf, turned it in his hand, then put it back with exaggerated slowness. Old-fashioned, he muttered. Loud enough for her to hear. Not much of a future for a shop like this. The words stung, but Mira stayed silent. A couple of customers in the corner pretended to browse, their eyes darting between the two. Sensing tension, Daniel stepped closer to the counter. Leaning forward slightly, "You're the owner?" he asked, his tone making it sound like an insult. Mira straightened her back. "Yes," she said firmly. "Interesting," he replied, his gaze moving over her like she was being judged. "I suppose this is the best you could manage?" Her hands tightened on the edge of the counter. She had dealt with rude people before. But there was something different about this man. His words didn't just aim to insult, they aimed to make her feel small, to remind her of the gap between her simple life and his endless wealth. Daniel looked around again, picking up a loaf of bread from the basket. "How much for this?" he asked lazily. Myra told him the price. He raised an eyebrow. "For something like this? Do people actually pay that?" "It's fresh," she replied. "Baked this morning." He gave a short laugh, the sound sharp and cold. "Fresh. In my world, fresh means imported from Italy the same day," he said, placing the bread back with a smirk. The customers were watching more openly now. One man stopped pretending to browse and stood still, his face tense. Mira could feel her heartbeat rising, but she refused to let this man see her lose control. She met his gaze without blinking. Daniel moved toward the counter again. "Resting both hands on it, he began. "You could sell this shop. Work for someone with actual success. Maybe learn how business really works." Myra's jaw tightened. "I know how my business works," she said, her voice steady. "Do you?" he said softly. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're just surviving. Not living." For a moment, silence filled the shop. Mira could feel the weight of his words pressing against her pride. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave, to take his expensive shoes and smug smile and walk out. But another part of her, the stronger part, knew she had to hold her ground. Daniel leaned back slightly. watching her with eyes that seemed to enjoy the discomfort he was creating. The air felt heavier, and even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder. Mira didn't speak, and in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. It was a silent promise to herself. She would not be broken by him, no matter who he was, no matter how much money he had. This was her shop, her life, and she would stand her ground, and though she didn't know it yet, this was the moment everything would begin to change. Daniel didn't leave. Instead, he walked slowly along the shelves, touching items as if they were strange things he had never seen before. Mira watched him carefully, wondering what game he was playing. Every step he took seemed deliberate, like he wanted to own the space just by being in it. A couple of customers left quietly. Not wanting to get caught in the middle, the few who stayed pretended to shop but couldn't hide their curiosity. Daniel picked up a small box of tea leaves and turned it over in his hands. "This brand," he said. "I remember seeing it in cheap roadside stalls when I was younger." He placed it back down with a smirk. "I didn't think anyone still sold." This Mira's chest tightened. She had grown up drinking that tea. Her father used to say it warmed the heart in winter better than anything else. It wasn't just a product, it was a memory, a piece of home. But Daniel's tone made it sound like trash. He moved to the counter again, leaning forward, so there. Faces were closer. "You could do better, you know," he said. "Upgrade this place. Sell imported goods, dress a little more polished." His eyes moved from her apron to her simple blouse. "You'd attract better customers if you looked like you belonged to a higher class." The words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just about her shop anymore. Now, he was judging her, her clothes, her background, even the way she presented herself. She forced a calm expression, but her hands clenched into fists behind the counter. "I dress for my work," she replied. "I'm not here to impress anyone." Daniel chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "That's exactly why you'll stay small," he said. "No ambition, no vision, no style." He tapped the counter with his fingers, as if sealing his judgment. His eyes glinted, like he enjoyed pushing people to their limits. A young boy who had been browsing in the corner froze in place. He glanced at Mira with wide eyes, almost as if silently asking if she was okay. Myra gave the boy a small nod, forcing herself to remain steady, but inside, the heat in her chest was growing. She had been raised to be patient, to let insults pass without a fight. Yet here was a man who seemed determined to tear away every layer of her pride. Daniel suddenly reached for a large basket of items near the counter. "I'll take all of these," he said, piling in bread, fruit, and jars of jam. The sight surprised Mira. It was more than any customer usually bought in a day. For a moment, she wondered if he was about to redeem himself. But then he tossed a crumpled bill onto the counter. It was barely enough to pay for half of what he'd taken. Mira looked at the money, then at him. "This isn't enough," she said evenly. Daniel leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You should be grateful I'm even here," he said loudly, making sure the other customers heard. "In my world, people pay to be seen by me." A sharp silence filled the room. Every eye was now on them. Mira felt her pulse in her ears. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was humiliation. And he wanted everyone to witness it. She took a slow breath. "I run a shop, not a charity," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You pay the price, or you leave the goods." Daniel tilted his head, studying her as if she were an unusual animal. "I see," he said finally. "You have spirit." But spirit doesn't pay bills. He slid the basket a little closer to himself, as though daring her to stop him. The tension in the air was almost visible now. One of the older customers shifted uncomfortably, whispering under his breath. Mira could feel the choice in front of her: back down and let him have his way, or stand firm and risk his wrath. Her pride told her there was no real choice at all. She would not let this man walk out thinking she was afraid of him. I won't sell to someone who doesn't respect me or my shop, she said quietly, but her words carried strength. Daniel's smile faded just a little. He straightened his back, his eyes narrowing for a second. Mira thought he might leave, but instead he stayed, his gaze locking on hers with an unspoken challenge. The shop felt smaller, the air thicker. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. In that moment, Mira realized she was no longer just defending a shop. She was defending every part of herself, her work, her family's legacy, and the belief that respect could not be bought. And Daniel, whether he admitted it or not, had just met someone who wouldn't bend. The air in the shop felt heavy. The basket of goods sat between them like a silent test. Mira stood behind the counter, her hands resting firmly on the wood. Daniel stood on the other side, tall and unmoving, his sharp eyes locked on hers. Around them, the few remaining customers held their breath, afraid to move or speak. Daniel's lips curled into a slow smirk. Without breaking eye contact, he picked up a jar of honey from the basket. "This," he said, turning it in his hand, "is the only thing in this place worth buying." He placed it back with a careless thud. "But even this is overpriced." The words were meant to sting, and they did, but Mira didn't flinch. He pushed the basket slightly toward her with one finger. "Fine," he said. "Put it on my account." Mira blinked. "You don't have an account here," she replied. "Then start one," he said casually. "I'll pay when I feel like it." Mira shook her head slowly. "This isn't that kind of shop," she said. "You pay now or you leave the goods." Daniel let out a short laugh, one that was cold and full of disbelief. "You really don't understand who you're talking to, do you?" He said. "I could buy this building, this street, this whole block before the day ends." His voice rose just enough for it to echo slightly in the small room. It wasn't just a statement, it was a warning. The customers shifted uncomfortably. An older woman in the corner quietly set down the bread she was holding. As if she didn't want to be part of this moment, Mira felt the heat rise in her chest. She had been patient for as long as she could, but now it wasn't just about her shop or the money. It was about the way he spoke, as if she was nothing, as if her life's work was beneath him. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "You may own a lot of things, Mr. Voss, but you don't own me." The words seemed to hang in the air. Daniel's smirk faded just a fraction. He studied her, as if trying to decide whether to be amused or angry. Then, with deliberate slowness, he picked up the basket again and started walking toward the door. Mira's eyes followed him, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her feet moved before she realized it, stepping out from behind the counter. "Stop," she said firmly. Daniel paused but didn't turn. "This shop," she continued, "runs on fairness, not fear." He finally turned his head. There was a spark in his eyes, not of kindness, but of challenge. "Oh," he said softly, "and what happens if someone ignores your rules?" "You leave without anything," Mira said, her voice calm but carrying a sharp edge. The tension snapped like a wire. Daniel's jaw tightened, his pride clearly struck. For a moment, it seemed like he might drop the basket and storm out instead. He placed it on a nearby table with an exaggerated slowness, as if mocking her. Then he stepped closer, until there was barely an arm's length between them. "You've got fire," he said quietly. "Most people don't even look me in the eye." Mira didn't move. "That's their choice." She said, "This is mine." The words landed with more weight than she expected. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She felt like she was speaking for everyone, who had been pushed down by someone richer and stronger. The silence in the shop was thick, even. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than normal. Daniel's gaze stayed on her for several long seconds before he finally stepped back. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick roll of bills. Without counting, he dropped the exact amount onto the counter for the goods, he said. Simply, then, after a pause, he added with a slight tilt of his head. And for your trouble, tossing in an extra note. Myra didn't touch the money. Instead, she looked him straight in the eyes. I don't want tips, she said, just respect. Something flickered in his expression, something he quickly hid. He picked up his basket, turned, and walked out of the shop without another word. The bell above the door jingled softly. The customers slowly began to breathe again. A young boy near the shelves whispered, You weren't scared. Myra gave a small smile. Of course I was, she said. But fear doesn't mean you stay silent. From outside, she saw Daniel step into a sleek black car before the driver closed the door. He looked back at her for a brief moment. There was no smirk this time. No mocking grin, just a look she couldn't quite read. Then the car drove away, leaving only the faint smell of his expensive cologne in the air. Myra returned behind the counter, her hands still shaking slightly. The shop felt different now. She didn't know if this was the end of it or if Daniel Voss would be back. But something deep inside her told her this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The next morning, Myra opened her shop as usual. The sunlight poured in through the windows, painting the shelves with a warm glow. She tried to focus on her work, stacking fresh bread, checking jars, sweeping the floor. But in the back of her mind, yesterday's encounter with Daniel Voss kept replaying. The way he looked at her, the weight of his words, the silent tension that had filled the room. She told herself it was over. Men like him didn't come back to small shops like hers, but deep down, a strange feeling told her that he wasn't finished. And she was right. Late in the morning, the bell above the door rang. Myra turned and froze. Daniel Voss stepped inside again, wearing the same confident expression as before. But this time, his arrival was louder. A small group of people followed him in business associates, judging by their sharp suits and cold eyes. They fanned out in the shop, pretending to browse, though their glances kept drifting toward her. Daniel walked straight to the counter. Myra, he said smoothly, as if they were old friends. I decided to give your little shop another chance. His voice carried through the room, making sure everyone heard. He picked up a jar of jam, then a loaf of bread, turning them in his hands like he was inspecting rare art. But the slight smirk on his lips told her he was here to play the same game again. I'll take these, he said, setting them on the counter. And since I'm feeling generous, I might even buy something else. Myra didn't smile. Then, you'll pay for them, she replied calmly. A couple of his associates chuckled quietly. Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly. Still as bold as yesterday, he said. But let's see how long that lasts. He leaned on the counter, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You had an audience yesterday. And you played your part well, he said. But today, let's see if you can handle the pressure without shaking. Her eyes didn't leave his. Mr. Voss, she said softly. You think this is about an audience, but it's not. That caught him off guard. He straightened slightly, his brow furrowing. This is about something you can't buy. She continued, her voice steady. You can buy land, buildings, even loyalty from people who care about your money, but you can't buy self. And you can't buy mine. The shop went quiet. His associates had stopped pretending to browse, their eyes fixed on the counter. Even a customer who had just walked in froze at the door. Sensing the weight of the moment, Daniel's smirk was gone now, replaced by a faint crease between his eyebrows. Careful, he said slowly. You're speaking to someone who could end this business with one phone call. Myra's voice didn't rise, but every word hit like a stone. Then, do it, she said. The words stunned him into silence. If you're the kind of man who destroys something small just to feel powerful, then yes, "Maybe you can close my shop," she went on, "but you will never make me kneel for it." Gasps rippled through the room. One of Daniel's men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this level of defiance. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at her, his jaw tight. Mira could feel her heart pounding. But she refused to look away. "You know," she added, "people think wealth makes you stronger, but it doesn't. It just makes it easier to hide weakness." Her words landed heavy. Daniel's lips parted slightly, but no reply came. It was the first time since they'd met that he looked uncertain. The silence stretched. Finally, one of his associates cleared his throat. Breaking the spell, Daniel glanced at him, then back at Mira. For a second, his eyes searched hers, as if looking for something: anger, fear, or maybe respect. But all he found was unshaken resolve. Without another word, Daniel reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and laid the exact amount for his purchase on the counter. No extra bills, no mocking tip, just the price. He picked up his bag, turned, and walked toward the door. His men followed quickly, their polished shoes clicking on the wooden floor. The bell above the door rang as they stepped out, leaving the shop quiet once again. Myra let out a slow breath, her hands gripping the counter to keep them from trembling. She didn't know what this would mean for her shop. Maybe he would come back, maybe not. But one thing was certain: she had spoken the truth in front of him and everyone else. And in that moment, Daniel Voss, the man who thought no one could stand against him, had nothing to say. For a few long seconds after Daniel Voss and his suited men left, the shop felt frozen in time. The only sound was the faint creak of the wooden door as it closed behind them. Myra stood still, her hands flat on the counter, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh in relief. She simply stood there, letting the silence settle. Then, from the back of the shop, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was the old man who came every week for tea. His weathered face broke into a proud grin as his applause grew louder. Soon, others joined in, a woman near the bread shelves, a young boy by the door, even the two quiet men who had been pretending to browse earlier. The sound filled the room, warm and steady, washing away the heavy tension that had gripped them moments ago. Mira blinked, a little caught off guard. She wasn't used to people clapping for her. Her life had always been about quiet work, baking, cleaning, selling. Nothing that drew attention. But now, every pair of eyes in the room looked at her differently. Not just as the shopkeeper, but as someone who had stood her ground against one of the most powerful men in the city. "You told him?" the old man said, his voice carrying a mix of pride and disbelief. Myra gave a small smile. "I told him the truth," she replied. "That's more than most people dare." The woman by the bread added, her tone warm but sharp with meaning. A few customers nodded, their expressions serious. They all knew who Daniel Voss was, and they all knew what it meant to speak to him like that. The young boy who had been watching quietly stepped closer to the counter. "Weren't you scared?" he asked in a small voice. Mira looked down at him and thought for a moment. "Yes," she said honestly, "but sometimes you can be scared and still do the right thing." The boy's eyes widened a little, as if those words planted something new in his mind. One man leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. "You know, he might not let this go," he said. "Men like him, they don't like losing in public." Myra nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "But I also know if I let him walk over me once, he'll think he can do it again." Her words were simple, but the firmness in her tone made several people exchange quiet looks. It was clear that her stand had struck a chord. By the time the last customer left, the shop was quieter, but somehow felt different. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt charged, as if something important had shifted. Myra began tidying up, sweeping the floor and putting things back in place. But her mind kept drifting back to Daniel's face. In those final moments, there had been something in his eyes, not just anger, but confusion, maybe even respect, though she couldn't be sure. As the afternoon sun began to lower, the bell above the door rang again. This time, it wasn't Daniel or one of his men. It was a group of people from the nearby bakery, carrying small bags of bread and pastries. One of them, a cheerful woman named Carla, placed a box on the counter. "For you," she said with a grin. "We heard what happened. Thought you could use something sweet." Myra felt a warmth spread through her chest. She thanked them, and they lingered for a while, talking about the scene they'd heard described from 3 different customers that morning. Each retelling seemed to make the moment grow larger, her voice stronger, his face redder, the tension sharper. Myra laughed quietly at the exaggerations, but inside, she knew the truth was already powerful enough. By early evening, she locked up the shop and stepped outside. The street was bathed in golden light, and a few neighbors waved as she passed. She noticed their smiles felt different, not just polite, but admiring, almost protective. Word had clearly traveled fast. And though she wasn't someone who sought fame, she could feel that she had earned something more valuable than money. She had earned respect, but respect came with a shadow. She knew Daniel Voss's pride had been bruised in front of witnesses, and men like him didn't forget that kind of wound. She didn't know when or how, but deep down she sensed he would return. And when he did, it wouldn't be just for bread or jam. For now, though, she allowed herself to breathe in the evening air. Her shop stood exactly where it had yesterday, but it no longer felt small to her. It felt like a place where something had been proven, a place where money had lost and dignity had won, and even if tomorrow brought new trouble, today she had shown the whole street that she wasn't afraid to fight for what was hers. 2 days passed without any sign of Daniel Voss. The shop was busy, more than usual, as curious faces came in to buy bread, but really to catch a glimpse of the woman who had stood up to the city's billionaire. Myra handled the attention quietly, never bragging, never exaggerating the story. But at night, when the street outside was empty, she sometimes wondered if she had really seen the last of him. On the 3rd afternoon, her question was answered. The bell above the door rang, and the shop fell silent. A sleek black car had stopped outside, and from it stepped Daniel. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was an older man in a dark gray suit, his hair silver and neatly combed, his posture straight and commanding. There was no arrogance in his walk, but there was an undeniable weight of authority. Daniel didn't speak first. Instead, the older man approached the counter while Daniel stayed a step behind. "Myra?" the man asked, his voice deep and calm. She nodded, her hands resting lightly on the counter. "I'm Victor Voss," he said, "Daniel's father." The words made the air in the shop feel heavier. The customers who had been browsing froze in place, sensing that this was not an ordinary visit. Myra's eyes moved briefly to Daniel, who met her gaze for only a second before looking away. Victor, however, didn't look away at all. His eyes were steady, measuring her the way a skilled judge might study a witness. "I've heard quite a lot about you these past 2 days," Victor said, "from my son. And from people in this town." Myra didn't reply yet, unsure where this was going. Victor's tone wasn't mocking like Daniel's had been. It was heavier, slower, almost like he was speaking to her with purpose. "I built my business from nothing," he continued. "I know what it means to fight for what you have." His gaze shifted toward Daniel for a brief moment. "But I also know what it means when pride blinds you." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. The customers shifted slightly, their eyes moving between the 3 of them. The shop had never felt so small. 2 days ago, Victor went on, "You told my son something that no one else has had the courage to tell him in years." Myra straightened, her voice steady. "I told him the truth," she said. Victor nodded slowly. Yes. And truth, my dear, is something far too many people are afraid to speak to men like us. The words caught her off guard. Men like us. It was the first time she realized he was including himself in the same category. She didn't know if that was good or bad. Victor stepped a little closer, lowering his voice so it carried, but not too loudly. You embarrass my son in public, he said, and if I were a different kind of man, I would be here to make you regret it. The customer stiffened at the edge in his tone. Mira didn't flinch, but Victor continued. I'm here for a different reason. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the counter. Inside was a business card and a check. I want to invest in your shop, he said simply. Not to own it, to grow it, to give you the resources. You need to make it bigger than you've imagined. The entire room seemed to inhale at once. Even Daniel looked surprised, his eyebrows lifting slightly. Myra didn't touch the envelope. Why? She asked, her voice cautious. Victor's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile. Because strength should be rewarded, he said. And because my son needs to learn something from you. Every eye turned to Daniel. His face was unreadable, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the counter. Victor didn't wait for him to speak. I want you to take him on for a week, Victor said. Not as a billionaire's son, but as an assistant in this shop. Gasps spread through the room. Mira's eyes widened. You want him to work here? She asked. Yes, Victor said. At your instruction, under your rules. No special treatment. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but tense. Father Victor cut him off with a glance that silenced him instantly. This is not a request, Victor said to his son before turning back to Mira. If you agree, the investment is yours, no strings beyond the 1 week. Mira studied both men in silence. The idea of Daniel Voss, the man who had walked into her shop full of arrogance, now working behind her counter. It was almost impossible to imagine, but she could see the weight of the moment, an opportunity to not just defend her dignity, but to shape his. The shop was so quiet, she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, she nodded once. All right, she said, her voice firm. But in this shop, he's just another worker. Victor's smile deepened slightly. Good, he said. Then we have an agreement. He turned to leave, and Daniel followed, his steps heavier than when he'd entered. The door closed behind them, leaving the customers buzzing with whispers. Mira stood still for a moment, realizing her life had just taken another unexpected turn. And though she didn't say it out loud, she knew one thing for certain. The week ahead was going to change everything. The first day of Daniel Voss working in the shop was unlike anything Mira had ever seen. He arrived in a plain shirt and jeans, clothes that still looked expensive but were far from his usual polished suits. Even so, his posture screamed discomfort. As if he couldn't believe he was there, the customers stared openly, whispering as they recognized the city's billionaire behind the counter. At first, Daniel hardly spoke. He moved stiffly, handing bags to customers without making eye contact. When Mira asked him to sweep the floor, he hesitated, clearly unused to such a task. But her firm gaze left him no choice. By the afternoon, his perfect hair had loosened, and there was a faint smudge of flour on his sleeve. The next few days were no easier for him. Mira had him stocking shelves, carrying boxes from the back, even cleaning the windows. At first, he complained under his breath, but she ignored it. She treated him like any other worker. No special treatment, no bending the rules, because of his name. And slowly, something began to shift. By the third day, Daniel had started greeting customers without being told. By the fourth, he was wrapping loaves of bread neatly, even adding a polite thank you as he handed them over. He still had flashes of arrogance, but there were also moments when His expression softened. Myra caught him once, watching an elderly woman count out her coins for tea. And instead of rolling his eyes, he quietly covered the difference without saying a word. On the 6th day, something unexpected happened. A group of boys ran into the shop, loud and laughing, knocking into one of the shelves. Before Myra could move, Daniel stepped in, his voice sharp but calm, telling them to watch where they were going, when one of the boys muttered an insult under his breath. Daniel didn't react with his usual coldness. Instead, he handed them their change and said simply, "Come back when you're ready to be respectful." The boys left quietly, and Myra found herself staring at him with new eyes. The final day of his week came faster than she expected. That morning, the shop was busy, and Daniel worked alongside her without complaint. He carried heavy boxers, swept the floor, and even joked with a couple of customers. It was strange to see him like this, less like the arrogant man who had first walked in, and more like someone human. In the afternoon, Victor Voss returned. The older man stepped inside with the same calm authority as before. Myra noticed his eyes, scanning the shop, taking in the shelves, the customers. And finally, his son, Daniel, walked over, no smirk. On his face, no air of superiority. "Father," he said simply. Victor gave a small nod, then looked at Myra. "Well?" Victor asked. "How was he?" Myra folded her arms, considering her answer. "He was stubborn," she said honestly. "But he learned." Victor's lips curved slightly. "That's more than most have been able to say," he replied. Then, to Myra's surprise, Victor took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "This," he said, "is the investment I promised. But I'm adding more, not just for your shop, but for you to decide how to help this street." Gasps rippled through the customers who were listening. Myra blinked, her voice soft. "Why?" Victor's expression warmed slightly, because strength with kindness is rare. "And you've shown both," he said. Before she could reply, Daniel stepped forward. "Myra," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I came here thinking I could humiliate you. But I ended up learning from you instead." The words seemed heavy for him to say, but they came out steady. "You were right. Money doesn't buy respect," he continued. "I thought I had power. But I see now I was just hiding behind it." Myra didn't know what to say. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter in front of her. "I want you to have this," he said, when she unfolded it. Her eyes widened. It was a signed document transferring ownership of the building her shop was in. "It's yours now," Daniel said. "No rent, no threats. Just yours." The customers murmured in shock. Myra looked from the paper to Daniel, her throat tight. "Why?" she asked softly. Daniel met her gaze without looking away. "Because you taught me what it means to stand for something," he said, "and I want to see this place stand for a long time." For the first time since she had met him, Myra saw no arrogance in his eyes, only sincerity, and maybe even a touch of humility. She folded the paper carefully and placed it behind the counter. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but carrying weight. Victor gave a single approving nod, and the two men turned to leave. As the door closed and the car outside drove away, the shop felt different again, not because of the money or the building, but because of what had just happened. Myra had faced down a man who thought the world belonged to him, and in the end, he had chosen to give something back. It was the kind of twist no one in the street would forget. And as she returned to her work, she knew this was more than the end of a story. It was the beginning of something far greater.